we can deprive our citizens for a certain number of rights that we don't want them to have. For example, LGBTI rights concerning Italy, or for other countries it would be migrants' rights or the Roma population rights, and then we deprive them from this, and we can still stay in EU because Orban has paved the way. So that's another threat to EU democracy, the way that he has shown an example. The other countries didn't react, the other member states didn't react, and now it seems that it's possible.
And like, how do you, how do you explain, because the European Union has been here for decades, so how can you explain, like, in the past decade that so many countries have taken this authoritarian push, like Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and Israel now as well? So like, how, like, do you think it's social media maybe? Like, I'm asking you, like, personally, what do you think?
No, I think that EU has been there for decades, but it's still very young. It's a very, very young democracy. We tend to forget it, but and it's very young in its competences. Also, I mean, if you go backwards 30 years ago, very little was done by EU. In fact, we have more and more EU competencies that have a huge implication for everyone's life in each member state. Now it's 50%, more than 50% of the national laws that come from EU law, but this is very recent. We also had for a long time a very distant relationship to EU. And then, yeah, it is a very young democracy, and it's still very unfunctional, dysfunctional because of this unanimity thing, because people feel that they need to serve their national interest more than the EU's interest. There are still not enough people in politics at the EU level that thinks as themselves as EU politics. Most of my colleagues in this parliament, but also some commissioners, and that's really bad when it's about the commissioners, and even more in the council, people are there to defend first their national interests. Very little people are there to defend the EU democracy. So I think it's quite normal. It's also, history has also shown us that democracy is never a given. We also tend to forget that democracy already existed in Athens, and then we went through centuries of obscurances, and then we had cities that were democracies, like in Flanders or in Italy in Middle Age, and then again we went back to very autocratic, authoritarian systems with kings and empires and all of this. So in fact, democracy is never a given. So I find it quite normal that you should always fight for it. What I find very sad is that we are lacking political courage and political will to fight for what is not a given: democracy, freedom, rights. And indeed, this EU is based on a very specific model, that is the idea that in this EU you can be whoever you want, whenever you want. You are not defined by your sex, by the color of your skin, by your social background, by your sexual orientation, by your political decisions and all this. This is very clearly defined in a number of texts, Article 2 of the treaties, but also then the Charter of Fundamental Rights and all this. This model is very, very, very rare in the world. You have other democracies in the world, but this idea that you are not defined by who you are at your birth is a very specific European model. And this is what Orban is against, and a certain number of other people, where they really believe that you should be assigned to a very specific place, stay in your little square and never move from that square all your life. And this will always be a fight. It will never be an assurance for the next 100 years, 300 years, if the planet survives all of this, because we also have the climate change problem. But even if we were to have a planet that is habitable for the next, livable for the next centuries, we will always have to fight for all of it, for this very precise idea, this very precise European model of you can be whoever you want, and you can make your choices and your own choices. And that needs a fight. And most of politics, but also journalists, some journalists, not all of them, but some journalists and some elites a bit everywhere, are sometimes not fighting enough for this.
And one last question. So you mentioned that there are significant problems to media pluralism in Hungary, and also, yeah, very nationalist and racist, pretty much conspiracies by Viktor Orban, and also the open society getting crushed by him. So universities and other educational systems, voting rules being changed, gerrymandering, constitutional changes, and the threats to LGBTQ and women's rights that you mentioned. So looking ahead to what you said about the European Union, what do you think are potential solutions for preserving the democracy in the European Union and United States and the rule of law in Hungary itself as well?
So we need to have, of course, laws and safeguards and rules. We are defining this year after year, decade after decade better, always better. It has to be said also that most of the tools that we had to defend rule of law in our text had never been used. And so we are also experiencing the use of them, and we are making them better because we are using them, and we are making them just exist because we are using them. And that's also sometimes something that I sometimes moan about, complain, is that I feel that we're not using the tools that we do have in the text and do exist. Commission has not always been using the tools. Council is not using the tools. The Parliament is the one that has been using all of the tools at its disposal, but it is also the institution that is basically the most limited. We have less powerful tools than Commission and Council. Yeah. So we have tools, we've been using them, we are now understanding even more how to use them, infringement procedures, Article 7 procedures. Now we have the conditionality mechanism, so saying that EU money can only be given if there's a number of conditions of rule of law that are there, blah, blah, blah. So we have these tools. We also need things to be more defined. We're getting better at it. One of the examples is that I think the Hungarian situation of media pluralism has been a wake-up call for EU a few years ago, because the story is that a number of media, TV, internet, radio, paper, were bought by oligarchs, one after the other, oligarchs that were around Viktor Orban, and then one day the government created a sort of a shell, a very opaque shell that is called the Kishma. We don't exactly know how this functions, and all of these oligarchs had this certain urge to donate all of the media they had bought to this shell, to this very opaque foundation, and now they are all in this thing. Of course, all of this was very organized and prepared, it's very clear, and EU was not able to react. And now we have this very bad situation about media pluralism. So now there's been a lot of brainstorming about it, and then we had, during this term, Vera Jourova, the commissioner, proposed this Media Freedom Act. It's not perfect, but it's a first step with a number of things about having transparency on who the media belongs to, a number of things protecting journalists, protecting the independence of the editorial board, etc., etc. So we are advancing, also learning from our mistakes. So yeah, I think that there's a number of things that are already there in the text that we should use better. There are things that we should propose. This conditionality mechanism was created at the beginning of this term. It was used during this term. It's still not perfect, so we need to improve it. But now the idea that rule of law is a full part of EU, and you cannot have EU with rule of law, seems to be in most of the minds. We have more and more text protecting rule of law and democracy. But once again, and I will finish on that, I really think that if you don't, I mean, you can have all the good text you want. If people are not using the text, if people are cheating on what is written in the laws, in the constitutions, in the rules, if people are ignoring them, and if people are not having courage, anyway, when authoritarian people arrive or far right arrives and says, we don't anyway want these rules, and we invent another way of doing things, and we think that authoritarian is the way to go. Well, you just need to resist, and you just need to have political will and political courage. You cannot go on just saying this is in the text and you're not doing it if they don't want to do it, because it's their trend. Their trend is to broke democracy and create new ways of governing that are authoritarian governance. So sometimes I have a bit the feeling that we've been saying to Orban, oh, this is not in the text and you should not be doing it. And then we were expecting Orban to just say, oh, sorry, oh, I'm very sorry, it was not in the text, so I should not be doing it. That has never worked. It's never worked anyway in history and anyway in the world. And it's not working with Hungary. And if tomorrow we have a new authoritarian person that comes in another country, I'm often concerned about France. If tomorrow we have an extreme far-right person coming to power through the presidential elections in France, it will be no point in saying politely, sorry, this was not in the EU text, and you did it anyway, because they will use the French powers and then crush the French powers to do it. And we are never completely shielded from that threat. Authoritarian threats exist because human beings can be that, sadly, and we just need to then fight.
Okay. I really, really appreciate it. I got a lot of new information.
Great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Delbos-Corfield, and thank you, Ms. Machakova, for coordinating the meeting as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry, I have to run, so I cannot do chatting because I really have a meeting at 2.
And best of luck.
It's not.
Best of luck for the future.
But have a very nice day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.